Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. And in this presentation on the New Deal, my last, I will examine Roosevelt's approach, as well as the first and second New Deals themselves. And I'll look at the criticisms made of Roosevelt and offer some interesting things to think about when assessing the success of the New Deal. The kind of thinking that can secure an A-star. Roosevelt's approach. Americans were desperate for immediate relief, and we'll come to that in a minute, but they also needed to have their confidence rebuilt. They needed hope, and that's why Roosevelt's inaugural speech was so important. His fireside chats too. And it's why the speed of action, the famous 100 days, was also important. It's so easy to overlook how Roosevelt gave the American economy confidence again and gave Americans hope. But it's so important. Don't forget, the stock market crashed when investors lost confidence in what was going on. And if whether America was or wasn't close to civil war is debatable, it was certainly in a bad way. Why? Because people had lost hope. They couldn't see a way out of the mess they were in. So Roosevelt's approach is important. Don't underestimate it. But let's go to the New Deal. Roosevelt gave America the New Deal he had promised them, to be overseen by the famous alphabet agencies. He targeted three things: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief from the extreme poverty for people who had lost their jobs, their homes, or their farms, as well as for people trapped in poverty before the Depression struck. Recovery so that both farming and industry could get going again and people could get their jobs back. And reform to provide America with a permanent basic welfare state. Unemployment insurance, help for the sick, disabled and the needy, and old age pensions too. Reform to give Americans better protection in the workplace. Reforms to protect people's savings and their homes. And reform to control the worst excesses of capitalist greed. It wasn't all addressed in those 100 days. There would be a second New Deal. But there's still a lot for you to deal with. You could have a specific A question on any of the agencies, so you need to cover them all in your revision. But my advice would be to make sure you pay particular attention to those that dealt with banking, those that dealt with unemployment, and the work of the TVA. And you need to know the particular problem that different agencies were set up to tackle, what the different agencies did, and their effect and limitations. But to the second New Deal, Roosevelt had done much to help America's victims of the Great Depression, the unemployed, and many farmers. Confidence had been restored with Roosevelt's fireside chats, and even more by his whole notion of active government. The Emergency Banking Act had restored confidence in banks, and the alphabet agencies had set about addressing specific problems, relief and recovery, and to some extent reform. But recovery was slower than in Europe, and unemployment remained stubbornly high. More needed to be done for the rural poor, farm labourers, sharecroppers and tenant farmers too. Also, Roosevelt wanted a fairer society. Workers needed protection and better pay and work conditions, and people needed welfare support. Roosevelt was convinced that the job was not yet finished, hence the Second New Deal in the summer of 1935, though it was announced in January of that year. As before, you will need to have an understanding of all the second wave of initiatives, and in this case, how they complemented what had already been done. But it was different in character to the New Deal of 1933. And you should give particular attention, I think, to the Wagner Act and to the Social Security Act. And of course, as you well know, Roosevelt was not short of critics. But before we move on to look at critics of Roosevelt, you just might get a question as to why he won the 1936 election by such a massive landslide. So do be prepared for that. The answer lies not just in the New Deals, but in his whole approach as president, his fireside chats, for example. Quite simply, he cared, and it showed. But with regards to his critics, you are fully aware there were those who thought he hadn't done enough. Huey Long, Roosevelt regarded him as one of the two most dangerous men in America. Dr. Townsend and Father Coughlin. What were their criticisms? And what were their alternative policies too? You need to be aware of that. And he was criticised, of course, for doing too much. There were those who thought he had done far too much. Roosevelt's battle with the Supreme Court could well feature in your exam, so make sure you're prepared for that. What specifically did they rule against, and what was their reasoning? And how did Roosevelt respond? But you need to be clear about the other criticisms coming from Republicans. My slide outlines the main focus of their criticisms. But who exactly were they? And what precisely were their criticisms? And their evidence? What did they have to back up their arguments? And so I come to how successful was the New Deal. Before looking at the New Deal itself, you should consider the recession of 1937, the Roosevelt recession, some people call it, that seemed to be the result of Roosevelt cutting back on government spending at the first signs of recovery, as well as being a possible topic for a question in its own right. It does seem to suggest the New Deal had helped the economy recover. And you should also consider the impact of World War II, for it was only with another World War that the scourge of unemployment was finally erased in America. Again, as well as being a possible topic for a question in its own right, this time it suggests, or seems to suggest, that the New Deal had not been the answer to America's biggest problem, at least, unemployment. But as to assessing the success of the New Deal, I suggest you go back to its aims: relief, recovery and reform, and how well it helped, or failed to help, different groups: farmers, workers, women, immigrants, African Americans. The problem for the historian, though, is how to measure. At what points do we compare economic statistics? Do we compare 1929, in other words, before the Depression began, with 1940, the year before America went to war? Or do we compare 1932-33, in other words, the depth of the Depression and the beginning of the New Deal? Do we compare that with 1940? And whichever dates we choose, can statistics ever tell the whole story? How do we measure the worry and the heartbreaking decisions millions of families had to make? So what else do we use? Anecdotal comments from the Depression years can help us understand what people were going through, but how representative are they? Who selected them and for what purpose? Even the work of historians poses problems. Are they themselves sympathetic to state intervention or fiercely opposed to it? There is also the matter of just what we should be assessing. Unemployment is the dominant indicator of the Great Depression, the most awful experience, with an impact on everything else in a person's life and that of their family. But we should also consider farm ownership and people's homes in the towns and cities. And was all this as important as the reforms made to the system as a whole? The Emergency Banking Act and later the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act? Whilst there are also the long-term benefits still being felt today. What about the conservation work? The work on the infrastructure, roads, dams and the like, and building schools and hospitals? And then there were the most difficult questions of all. How do you measure the degree of hope or confidence Roosevelt gave back to the American people? The degree to which their morale was lifted? Whilst there's also the change to the way many Americans regarded their government and what they expected of it. Did Roosevelt threaten democracy or restore faith in it? How do we measure the importance of such intangible things? Integrate just some of these things into your work and you will surely lift its quality to the dizzy heights of the A-star. And that's been my aim throughout these key factors presentations. So that's where I'll end it. The very best of luck with your revision. Don't forget my website too, History Made Easier. I hope it can help you there too. And the very best of luck in your exam. Get that A-star. But for now, I do thank you for listening. Cheers.